Bible study on love. After that, we got a couple or 3 weeks till Tyler gets back. He wants to do a Bible study. In that time, I was talking to Chad. We can do whatever y'all want. He was talking about, man, he's all up in Corinthians right now with some Bible studies and reading on his own and stuff. That's something we can look into. You know, whatever you guys want to do, I'm open. Preferably not another book of prophecy. Okay. But anyway, all right, so we'll just wrap up because chapter 11, the vast majority of chapter 11, it's about a 45-verse chapter, but it's all one prophecy. There's no need for us, it doesn't behoove us to really go verse by verse through this, unless it's just like one of those things, I just want to know. I'm a history buff. I want to see how prophecy matches up with history. I don't think anybody really cares. And then chapter 12 is really dicey, but it's only a few verses. We'll just kind of talk about that for a little bit. So anyway, okay. Synopsis of chapter 11. We've kind of gotten the first couple verses of chapter 11. I think we're going to pick up with verse 5. But anyway, heading into chapter 11, what we've already looked at in the book of Daniel is we've had a couple of prophecies leading up to this point. Where, if you remember a few weeks back, we talked about the 70-year prophecy. That's when the Jews were in exile in Babylon, and they were supposed to go back and rebuild the temple. That's the 70-year prophecy. Then the 70-week prophecy, remember that was the one that was kind of dicey. There was a kind of apocalyptic view, and then an end of Jewish age Roman. There's two views on that. That's the one we had the diagram, you know, and 70 weeks and 69 weeks. So there's a lot of prophecy. And again, the views are a little scattered on them. Basically, 5 through 19, for the most part, really it's about 5 through 40. But verses 5 through 19, basically, it's just verse by verse describing a war. That's all Daniel 11 is, the vast majority of it. Describing a war. If you want to, and I encourage everybody to read, man. Read your Bibles. Read Daniel 11. It is history-based. It might be kind of boring and dry to you, but if you're interested, read Daniel 11. We'll kind of hit on the hot spots and the main topics here. The war that's being talked about in Daniel 11 is between two of the kingdoms of Alexander. Remember, Alexander the Great's empire fractured. After he died, boom, it's gone, it's no more. 4 of his generals in various parts of the empire said, okay, this is mine now. One of them was Seleucus, who ended up being the emperor of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire was almost all the way to India. It was Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Babylon, Syria. It was the largest part of the fractured empire. Ptolemy, the other king, was in Egypt. He was in Alexandria at the time. Says, I like this. This is mine. I own this now. So that's when you have Greek kingdoms basically owning or taking over some, parts of the Mediterranean, parts of, like, why was Cleopatra Greek and not Egyptian? Well, because she was Greek. The Greeks occupied Egypt during that time. That's all it means. So that's what verses 5 through 20 mainly are talking about. It's just the war between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. That's all it is. It's verse by verse. It's going to go through and talk about a number of. It's going to talk about a number of people. So and so invaded south. This king invaded back north. It's just back and forth for verse after verse after verse. We don't really need to get into too much depth on it. I will say that it's very, very encouraging, I guess, as a Christian. If you read chapter 11, if you take it upon yourself and you want to read chapter 11 and then do some background history, do some background reading on it too. A lot of biblical scholars will tell you that 130 to 135 prophecies are fulfilled in Daniel 11. 100 to 135 prophecies are fulfilled during this time of warfare. That is amazing. A lot of biblical scholars, or not a lot of non-biblical scholars, have a problem with Daniel. There's no way this is written back then. There's no way. Because they couldn't have known all this. Well, God can. And if God's prophesying it. So, To me, it's another case where the Bible proves history. This was written before these events. A lot of secular scholars don't agree, don't like to hear it. They like to refute it. So anyway, verses 5 through 19, basically about the warfare between the two kingdoms. Just going to hit some highlights in there. If you have any questions, if you're skipping through and you have a question, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, if you have a question on anything, just to ask. You may see a verse in there and you're just like, wow, that's kind of fishy. What's that mean? And I've done some research, done some reading on the whole chapter in general. I could probably answer your question if you just have a question on something. So feel free to ask. That's what the first 20 or so verses are talking about. There is a verse in chapter 11, verse 14, that I highlighted because I thought it was a little bit of a highlight in the chapter there. In verse 14, it says that now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. That's the Ptolemies in Egypt. Many shall rise against the king of the south. Also violent men of your own people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. You have to remember that what's going on here. Remember, we started this a couple weeks ago. Daniel's at the river. He sees a vision. Basically, he's being told the vision. He's being told what's going to occur. The prophecy. He's being told what's going to occur. One of the lines in the prophecy was this line in 14: "Violent men and rising up against the kingdom of the south." Every commentary that I've read, every biblical scholar that I've noted. This is a direct reference to the prophecy that the Israelites themselves will join the war. They kind of switch sides during the war. But this is a reference to the Maccabees. You may have heard about the Maccabean revolt. Maybe you've heard or seen the old movie Masada. The Maccabees were a very militaristic, very hardcore, scriptural sect of the Jewish population at the time. You might even call them domestic terrorists. But they rose up and kind of joined the war here. Basically switched sides. But that's what verse 14 is talking about. Verse 18 is another verse I thought I'd highlight. After this, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Again, this whole section, this whole chapter is dealing with an ongoing war. Verse 18, direct reference to Cornelius Scipio, Roman general. Basically, verse 18 is just talking about the Seleucid ruler at the time. I believe it's Antiochus III, called Antiochus the Great. He was expanding the Seleucid Empire. He was at war with Egypt. He came in conflict with the Romans. That's a direct reference to the Romans there in verse 18. Verse 19, the very next verse. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Verse 19 is a direct historical reference to Antiochus III. He was murdered by his own people after his failure against the kingdom of the south and his interactions with the Romans. He came back to Babylon in disgrace. He tried to loot a temple there, and people didn't like it very much, and they murdered him. Verses 21 through 34, that's kind of an important section in the book that we talked about before. We've talked about this guy for like the last 3 or 4 weeks. Verses 21 through 34 directly reference Antiochus or Antiochus IV. Do you guys remember who that guy is? We've talked a lot about him. Any thoughts, comments? You tell us, history teacher. Antiochus IV, you may remember this guy. We mentioned him a few times. He's the guy that basically once the northern kingdom, once the Seleucids had taken control of the Holy Land and taken control of Jerusalem and Palestine, this guy was hardcore Greek deity follower. He believed in the Greek pantheon of Olympus, Zeus, Apollo, all the Olympic gods. He's the guy that sacrificed the pig on the altar in the temple. He's the guy that slaughtered, some accounts say about 80,000 Jews. He's the guy that murdered the high priest, or had it ordered. He ordered the murder of the high priest. This guy, a lot of people have considered essentially the next best thing to the Antichrist. He's a bad dude. So that's what verses 21 through 34 are talking about this guy here. I'll read a little bit here, some notes I've taken. We do know, we've been talking about this guy for several chapters, and Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Epiphanes, was referenced as far back as Daniel 8. And if you remember the vision that we saw in Daniel 8 of the shaggy goat and the ram, it talks about the shaggy goat having two horns, one large horn, and then the small horn starts to become more prominent. This is a reference to this guy here. Out of them came a little horn, and this is what this guy's called. A lot of times he's referenced by biblical scholars. They'll put out by his name, like in question, quotation marks, or whatever, little horn. This is the reference to, this is the little horn, is this guy, Antiochus IV. Out of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. The glorious land is the Holy Land. And it grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's see, verses 21 through 34, some notes I have here. These verses document the tyrannical oppression of the Jewish people by Antiochus, who by force tried to make the Egyptian people forego their religion and essentially favor all things Greek, worship the Greek gods, even refer to him as a god. In fact, this was the time that the Maccabees and the Maccabeans, who were resisting Hellenic rule. In Antiochus Epiphanes, they saw the worst tyrant of history. And, at least at the time, that's what they thought. That's what they documented. This guy was bad news. Antiochus Epiphanes, Epiphanes or Epiphanes. I don't read Greek. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but Epiphanes is what we would call his last name. It's not really his name, it's a title he gave himself. So if you ever see in the book, it says Antiochus Epiphanes or Epiphanes. What that means, translated in Greek apparently, is manifest. So Antiochus manifest. He took on that title to indicate to the people that he was the manifestation of a Greek god. He took on that role. That's what he wanted the people to call him because he viewed himself as God. He required men to worship him as the living God. I didn't put it up there in the notes, but in that section under Antiochus IV, there is a couple of verse section where it talks about in verses 22 through 24, you may have seen, it talks about the Prince of the Covenant. I don't know if anyone had a question on that or had looked at it and saw it and had some thoughts. But, hey, Jack, just go ahead and read verses 23 through 24 there.
Sure. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the Prince of the Covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done. nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time.
What that section is talking about is this guy that we're talking about right now. This is just a subsection of the whole story, verses 21 through 34 of this guy, Antiochus. And what it's talking about is basically to fund his wars. The Holy Land was under an extreme tax rate. He was very area. This verse talks about the historical notes that we have of him going into temples, stealing the gold and silver, desecrating the temples in the area, basically using the treasures to fund his wars. And it talks about the Prince of the Covenant. Historical and religious scholars that I've come across, the Prince of the Covenant is pretty much universally agreed on. It has to be the high priest in Jerusalem. The Prince of the Covenant, it has to be Jewish. It has to be in some form related to Judaism or Jewish people. The Prince of the Covenant here is the high priest Onias III, who Antiochus, as I mentioned a while ago, had murdered. He had him assassinated. You may remember last chapter. Some of you are probably thinking about, well, prince in last chapter. Remember we were talking about the princes in terms of angels. A little bit of a linguistic thing there. But every scholar, everything that I've read, this doesn't have anything to do with angelic beings like princes did last chapter. It is, in fact, actually talking about a Jew, a person. And the Prince of the Covenant is, in their opinion, the high priest. Let's see, one note I had on that. This one scholar says the high priest bore the title Prince of the Covenant because he was the de facto head of the theocracy at the time in Israel. And the term covenant is used for the Jewish state. The high priest, essentially, if you think about it this time in history, was kind of like what the Pope is now, or he's almost like the president or the ruler, the Ayatollah, maybe, of the Israeli state, because I don't guess the Israelis or the Jews at this time had a kingdom, had a king or anything. They were under subjugation, so he would have been the guy that everybody went to, being that Israel has always been a theocratic state, a very religious state. So that's the notes I had on that. Any questions or comments or anything? Verse 28 references how Antiochus does great harm and persecution against the Jews, and he shall return to this land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the Holy Covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. Basically talking about how he oppressed the Jewish people at the time. Verse 29 in the prophecy, the very next verse, goes on to talk about how Antiochus again invades Egypt. Remember, the whole chapter is about ongoing warfare. It lasts for over 100 years. So you go from Ptolemy the IV to like Ptolemy the VII during this time. It wasn't like a 20-year war. This goes on for about 100 plus years. Verse 29 references this. Can someone read verse 29 for us real quick?
At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before.
Actually, read the next verse too.
For ships of Kittim shall come against them, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant.
Does it tell you in whatever you're reading? I may have you try to look this up too. Does it tell you who, you saw the reference to Kittim? Kittim. Does anybody know who Kittim or what Kittim is? Does it tell you in your reference there or anything? I mean, it's okay if it doesn't. It may not say anything about it. Because I was looking at all the studies that I was doing on this, and there was some discussion of Kittim. It's actually agreed upon who it is. It's just that we've never heard this term before, probably. This term is referenced in Genesis in a couple of places, I believe. And maybe in one other book in the Old Testament. But basically, verses 29 and 30 during the prophecy here, it talks about Antiochus fighting colonies, warfare. Number verses 29 and 30, Antiochus is going down to Egypt. I'm going to take over Egypt. Whoa, got a problem here. Romans are there. They're intervening. They're like, yeah, you need to step back to where we came from. He doesn't like it very much. He goes back. This enrages him. He persecutes the Jews even further, even more than after that incident. Verses 30 and 31, right after that, little notes I took here. This again enrages Antiochus, such that he turns his attention against the temple, turns his attention to the temple and to the Jews. In verse 31, we see that Antiochus would send forces against the temple in Jerusalem, all the Jewish religious practices, such as circumcision, possessing the scriptures, sacrifices, and the feast days. In chapters 11 and 12, you're going to see a lot of references to the ends of the feast. The feast days were forbidden by penalty of death. The desecration continues as an altar of Zeus was erected in the temple, and again, swine were offered, sacrificed on the altar, completely defiling the Jewish temple and religion. Defiling the temple of God. Again, this whole section of chapter 11 is basically just talking about what a bad guy this is and the constant warfare and political and cultural turmoil going on at this time in the Holy Land and in Egypt and Asia. So that's basically what the majority of the chapter is about. Is there anything that anybody had to comment on or question on anything they saw in there maybe? It's okay if you don't. Again, it's just a lot of verse by verse, just basically people's names and warfare. I just didn't feel like we really needed to get into a verse by verse study of this. Verses 35 through 39, that's where it gets a little dicey again in chapter 11. Here's where you start getting multiple views of the prophecy. We dealt with this a couple of weeks ago. You remember with the diagrams, there's the premillennial view, there's the non-millennial view, and then there's the interpretive view of the 70 weeks prophecy. The one view is that it's dealing with the Roman time period and the destruction of Jerusalem. The other view is that this is an end of times prophecy. I'll just go ahead and read 35 through 39 real quick, and we can read it and see if there are any comments or questions or anything. And some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Then the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself before them all. But in their place he shall honor the God a God of fortress, and a God which the fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign God, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. Any thoughts? Because that's the controversy in this chapter. That's the problem. That's where it gets dicey. That, to a lot of people, is a dual prophecy fulfilled. Not only is that a Roman prophecy fulfilled, or maybe even Antiochus IV prophecy, it's an end of times apocalyptic prophecy. A lot of people say this is the Antichrist. I guess I can see it. I mean, and I'm certainly not judging anyone. If you have a view on this, that's fine. I mean, we're not all going to be in lockstep on every issue. That's fine. We don't need to be. That's the view of a lot of people in the religious world. Is this is talking about the Antichrist? It's not talking about Antiochus IV, and it's not talking about a Roman emperor, which is pretty much the church's view on that. I also agree that this is probably not an end times prophecy. I may be wrong on that. It's an issue, it's text that really needs to be studied on, thought on. Is it a life or death thing if we don't agree on it? No. But I'm compelled to bring it up because it is in the chapter. It's info that people may have comments or questions on, or may have specific thoughts on. That's fine, we can talk about it.
I mean, it makes sense. Well, I think
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was saying it makes sense. A lot of people do that.
Yeah.
Because like it kind of prefixes it in verse 40, it's like at the time of the end.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Now, we have looked through Daniel, and all through Daniel, when it talks about end times or time of the end or the latter days, it's talking about the Jewish age. It's talking about the end of the covenant. It's talking about the end of the Jewish state at the time, the Jewish religion. Now, if I'm a novice and I just pick up the Bible and I read that, I'm thinking end days means end of time. But in the context of Daniel, it's generally referring to the end of the Jewish first century, basically. Daniel 11, all the way to 40, and then all of a sudden it's end times prophecy. The rest of this is warfare. This is all known to history. Every bit of what's in 11 is known to history, recorded by history. From there to there. I just don't know how. I do know how you do it, but how they do it is because of the next chapter. But you have to take things in context. And when I read the context of the chapter, it's not talking about the rapture. It's talking about a time during that time, and it's dealing with the Jewish people at that time. It's not dealing with the 22nd century or the 21st century or whatever. Any comments or thoughts?
So one thing that I've noticed is a repeating theme, right? Within the scripture, we see often that the people of God fall away and they have to be saved, and then they come back and they're good for a little while, and they become arrogant again and they get lost. But on the same hand, if you look at the people who are on the other side, all the way through the Bible, there's always someone who's an adversary to good, right? That's evil.
Yeah.
And they all follow the same strategy, right? They think they're going to win with vastness of numbers, the strategy of violence, desecration, worshiping idols and other gods. That happens all the way through the Revelation book, right? So it's hard for me to get bought off. I'm on the same position as you, that this is apocalyptic, this is actual end times. But I can absolutely see that the strategy that's used here is similar to every other strategy that has happened throughout the history of mankind, right? They always they think that they're going to be stronger than what God is because they think of themselves higher than they should.
Yeah. So do you think this is apocalyptic?
I don't.
You didn't, yeah.
I just believe that there's a lot of similarities because the strategies are always the same.
Yeah. And the wording in the Bible, it's, you have to study your Bibles, and you're going to come across things that's going to confuse you. It's going to make you think, well, this is talking about this. But if you read the context overall, it's like, well, it's not okay. Maybe it's not talking about that. But if you read a verse or a section, there's stuff in the Bible, none of us understand everything in the Bible, and we're never going to understand everything in the Bible. And that's okay, because you don't need to have faith. But there's a verse in, I can't remember what it was. I was asking Mason about this verse a while back. Like, we've had this debate before about good and evil. What does God? Can God tolerate sin? God cannot tolerate sin. So on and so forth. There's a verse in the Old Testament, I think it's in Isaiah, I'd have to look it up, where God says, I create evil. And I asked Mason, I'm like, what do you make of that? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, I don't even want to think, there's going to be stuff in the Bible that you just don't know. You just don't know, and that's okay. But yeah.
I have to say, I have to just follow that up with, you may not be able to get to the details, but you can understand the point.
Yeah.
Right? If you read Daniel, the point of Daniel, especially in chapters 11 and 12, is that there's going to be some really dark times, but at the end, God will win.
Yeah.
That's the point of it.
And that's what I put on there. Basically, all this that we've talked about, all this, all these verses, all the prophecy, what's the bottom line application?
Yeah.
What's the bottom line application? Can someone turn over to Daniel 2, verse 44? Daniel 2, verse 44. All this was talked about way earlier in the book. To a degree, not as in depth. So can someone read Daniel 2:44?
And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the people shall not be left to other people. They shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
What kingdom is that?
Heaven.
Kingdom of God. That's the bottom line. If you remember in 244, and when some of us started this over a year ago at 20th Street, if you remember, one of the first things from Daniel was when they had the vision. I think Nebuchadnezzar sees a vision of this massive statue, and the head was like of gold, and the legs were of bronze, and the feet were of clay. What it was talking about was all the empires to come. It was talking about his empire, then the Greeks, Medo-Persians, Romans, so on and so forth. And Daniel interprets that vision for him. And that's what he interprets. He says, these things are going to come to pass, and it is, I think it says in my mind, it said, it is sure, to come. There's going to be a kingdom that trumps all these kingdoms. It doesn't matter. You're going to suffer. Things are going to happen. You have to keep the faith. There is a kingdom coming that is greater than the Greek kingdom, or the Medo-Persian kingdom, or the Babylonian kingdom. There's something coming, and God will establish that kingdom, and it will be greater than all the others. And it says, and you read it, it says, in what times will this happen, or will it happen to their people, and what times?
In the days of these kings.
In the days of these kings. That's what we're talking about now in Daniel 11. But verse 40 is apocalyptic. You can't get there from the rest of the chapter. You just can't do it. It doesn't fit the context. So the bottom line is the application to us. There's a kingdom coming, he's telling Nebuchadnezzar. There's a kingdom coming. It's going to be greater than yours and all the others. And there's going to be suffering, and I think that's the application in a lot of Daniel's. There's going to be suffering. You're going to have to deal with some stuff. You have to keep faith. You have to keep strong. A lot of people interpret the end of that chapter because they go into chapter 12. The language in chapter 12 is very apocalyptic language. It's very more spiritual language. We're going to cover it real quick. If anybody has questions or comments, feel free to ask. You're doing a lot of reading over there. How much you find?
Definition of Hebrew of evil talks about it's not evil in the sense that we think of evil, adversity, affliction, a lot of different things, but that can also be thought of in our English language as evil, right?
What I was looking at, it says calamity. And God did, he created, he caused the flood. He's done a lot of calamity, but he is not evil. He doesn't create evil.
Yeah.
And that's my interpretation of it.
It's, we got a Bible study on that one. I mean,
Even though they say evil, that's not really the true
right.
translation
Yeah.
of the word Greek word.
That's what you had. That's what
Yeah.
people have to keep
That's
in
just our perception.
Right.
Evil. Oh,
Yeah.
evil.
Yeah.
When we think of
Good
evil,
point.
we don't think of calamity and hurricanes and the great flood. We don't think of that as evil. We just think of that as calamities.
Yeah. Very important point.
Yes.
You always have to consider the interpretation in the original language. And I'm dealing with that right now with kind of doing a breakdown of the book of Jude. It's pretty intense. But getting into chapter 12, verses, it's kind of hitting the high points again. We can read the entire chapter if you guys want to. It's not long, but it's basically, let's read it. Verses 1 through 4. This kind of relates to what we were talking about again last week. I'll read verses 1 through 4. And remember, this is a continuing in the conversation that Daniel's having with the angel. When the angel's telling him about the things in the book. This is not the chapter break, just disregard the chapter break. This is a continuation of the same conversation. Verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. You remember we talked about that last week? We're talking about angels and princes, and it almost seems to indicate that, countries, nations, empires, they kind of have, maybe a satanic demon or angel or whatever the terminology, fighting on their behalf, or, an angel of God fighting on their behalf. Just thought that was interesting. I know we talked about that last week. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And that's where it's getting dicey. That's where it sounds apocalyptic. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the end of time, or the time of the end. I'm sorry. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. First 4 verses there. A lot of people interpret that as apocalyptic language, a time of the apocalypse, or maybe the tribulation or the great tribulation. Again, in the overall context of Daniel, it's hard to determine. Even the biblical scholars that I read that kind of think that's apocalyptic also admit it's dicey. It's just a matter of interpretation, because they can see that the argument that it deals with the end of times as it pertains to the end of the Jewish time under the Romans. Took a couple of notes on it. Jesus does address this in Matthew 24, in verses 15 through 28, where it talks, I believe that's where it talks about the desolation of abomination. Matthew 24, 1 and 2 sets the context that Jesus is describing the signs that one stone will not be left upon another in the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. Luke 21 is a parallel passage that says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, then recognize that her desolation is near. For a fuller discussion on the subject, You can also refer again to, there's a study for Matthew 24. Premillennialists will have you believe that this is the great tribulation that Jesus and Daniel spoke of, that has not yet happened and will occur against all mankind. However, the angel told us in chapter 10, verse 14, that these things were against the Jews. Daniel 10:14 talks about this being happening to the Jews. Premillennialists think that this is the end of times tribulation. Therefore, it wouldn't be just the Jews; it would be everyone involved. That's a little bit of discrepancy there. It seems to validate that what Jesus said in referencing the destruction of the temple and the city in Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and again in Luke 21, parallel passages. Further, as we have shown many times in our study of Daniel, the phrases last days, latter days, time of the end of the age are all references to the end of the Jewish age, and the Jewish system and the Jewish covenant, not necessarily the end of time. I'll read verses 5 through 7 real quick. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others on this riverbank. Again, two others what? Remember how last week we were talking about, it seems that Daniel was seeing multiple angels and multiple entities during this time. It says right here, then I looked, and there stood two others on this riverbank. And the other on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, he swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, a times, and a half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be completed. The one thing in there you're probably not going to know unless you've already looked it up. A time, times, and a half a time. That is a year. It's just a reference to a year. A time is a year. So it's going to be a year, 2 years, and then half a year. Comes to a grand total of 3.5 years. I just thought that was interesting because 3.5 years. Does anybody remember seeing anything on the board about the 3.5 years? It's what some in the religious community consider the Great Tribulation. There's the tribulation. You remember it's a 7-year period. Tribulation for 3.5 years. Great Tribulation for 3.5 years. Just thought that was interesting. Is it Roman or end of times? Is 5 through 7 talking about a Roman period or end of times period? Because if you interpret end of days as the end of the Jewish covenant, Jewish supremacy basically, Jewish time, then that's the first century. Why? Well, because Jesus came. So the Judaism and the Old Testament supremacy or covenant is basically come and gone. It's done away with. When we read in those verses, it talks about the power of the holy people being shattered. Well, the holy people, the Jews, if you interpret it that way, then their power is shattered because there is no old covenant anymore. Jesus has shattered their power. He's shattered the old covenant. He's brought in the new covenant. So again, it's just, you can interpret this. You can interpret really anything any way you want to. But keeping things in context would again seem that this is a first century end of times that he's talking about, a first century Roman destruction of Jerusalem. Any comments? Tyler, you're looking pretty hard over there. What are you thinking?
I was just trying to wrap my head around all this.
I know.
So I've been looking at my phone a lot too, so I was looking at some commentary.
Yeah.
Some commentary,
And if you have something, bring it up. Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot to wrap your head around. And I like history. I'm a history buff, and even to me, it's like, man, it's exhausting. But we should focus on that aspect of it, just in the sense of maybe trying to interpret, and in the sense that, okay, the Bible proves history. But the bottom line is always, and should always be, whenever we're reading something, it should be like what Chris says. What is the bottom line? What is the application to us? That's always the bottom line. Let's see, verses 5 through 7, we've already read that. 8 through 11 talks about the wicked and the wise. It mentions the time, the half times, and 3.5 years. Verses 8 through 11, it talks about the 1290 days. We're kind of dealing with that on Wednesday nights in Revelation. If you look at verses, someone want to read verses 8 through 11 real quick? We're pretty much done with the chapter.
As for me, I heard but could not understand, so I said, My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end of time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly. And none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. For the time and the regular sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination of desolation is set up. There will be 1290 days.
Okay, so basically what's happening here, again, continuation of the conversation that started in chapter 11. The man in linen makes this statement, and Daniel's like, basically, hey, I don't understand. I just do not know what's going on here. And that's when he's told, hey, wrap it up, seal it up in the book. Basically, he's telling him, this doesn't apply to you right now. You don't have to worry about this. Figurative language, it then talks about the 1,290 days. Again, we're talking a lot about this in Revelations. Numbers and their meanings. Any comments or thoughts on the 1290, the number 1290? Does it mean it? Have you ever heard anything? Is it a literal number or is it a figurative number? Does it matter? We're talking a lot on Wednesday nights in Revelation. Numbers have meaning sometimes, and sometimes they're used. And we've seen it in Daniel. I think it was in chapter 10. We saw the 70-week prophecy where sometimes like 69 weeks can just be a figurative number used to illustrate a longer period of time, or 1 week or 7 weeks can figuratively illustrate a shorter period of time. Does 1,290 days, is that a figurative number or a literal number? Don't know. It could be a figurative number. I don't see how it could be literal. I guess it could be if you calculated up what that was in years and related it to the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Could be. Because it talks about the 1,290, then it mentions the 1,335 days. Is that a figurative number or is it literal? I would interpret that as a figurative number, basically talking about implying a blessing due to the endurance of the believer. You've lived past the tribulation of the 1,290 days. You're into the 1,335 days. I'll just read the last two verses real quick. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But you go your way till the end, for you shall rest and will rise in your inheritance at the end of days. The last statement in the chapter is actually, I didn't record it, but it's actually a reference to Revelation. It's mentioned earlier in the book of Revelation. Got some numbers there to deal with at the end of the chapter. I guess basically you just have to determine or study or think about, is it a literal number or is it a figurative number? Why is it literal if it is? Any thoughts, comments? Yeah. Fun stuff. It's tough to follow, I know. Very tough to follow. Probably if you had a better teacher, it would be easier. But I kind of did the whiteboard, hit the high points. I took that route this week. I thought it might make it a little easier to just kind of stay with and follow. I don't know. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Bottom line in application, again, in chapter 12. What's the bottom line in application? He's talking about either literal or figurative apocalyptic things happening here. Language, destruction, death, turmoil. It's either the end of times or it's the Roman period, destruction of Jerusalem. what's the bottom line? What's the application for your life? What do you take away from this? Fight through oppression and keep the faith. Your reward is at the end. Your reward is laid up in heaven. It's not on this earth. And that's something that we've talked about a lot in this congregation. We know as Christians, the Bible tells us you're going to suffer. There's going to be times in our life, and we do have times in our life where we just don't, God, why are you letting this happen to me? Or I just don't like the way things are going. Why don't I have the money that I think I should? Why don't I have the possessions that I think I should? Our treasures are not laid up on this earth. They're laid up in heaven. You remember what Jesus tells the rich young ruler? Lay up treasure in heaven. And I think that's the message basically of 11 and 12. Keep the faith. Keep fighting. Don't give should hopefully give us hope, encouragement, when we read darker passages, darker books, darker chapters in the Bible like this. Everything in the Bible can't be rosy and flowery, and it's just like, my sermon last week, sometimes we have to preach about the not so fun and the hard stuff, as well as preaching about the fluffy, cuddly stuff as well,